tout le monde, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue à cette conférence portant sur le thème The Geopolitics of Pipelines in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. It's hard to say. Je m'appelle Frédéric Gagnon, je suis titulaire de la chaire Raoul-Dandurand en études stratégiques et diplomatiques ici à l'UQAM, à l'Université du Québec à Montréal. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette activité. On a le plaisir de recevoir un collègue des États-Unis que je vais vous présenter dans un instant, avec qui on travaille depuis bon nombre d'années maintenant et qui se spécialise sur la géopolitique au Moyen-Orient, en Afrique du Nord également, mais au Moyen-Orient surtout. Donc, le titre de la présentation, je l'ai déjà mentionné. Je vais vous présenter notre invité. Il s'appelle Paul Lenze. He is a teaching professor and coordinator of MPA special programs in the Department of Politics and International Affairs at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. He teaches and researches in the fields of international relations and comparative politics and also public administration, with a focus on civil-military relations, Middle East politics, U.S. national security and foreign policy, governance and political development. He has published numerous books. One of them is Civil-Military Relations in the Islamic World, Syrian Forced Migration and Public Health in the European Union, and also Understanding and Explaining the Iranian Nuclear Crisis, Theoretical Approaches. These books were published at Lexington Books in 16, 19, and 20. So Paul is very productive, He's currently working on 2 additional books. Maybe he will say a few words about these books as well today. He can if he wants to talk about his current research. And this current research examines power intervention in the Middle East, emerging powers grant strategy, the geopolitics of resources, and public health as a human security issue. Paul is also a member of the Center de l'Observatoire sur le Moyen-Orient et l'Afrique du Nord. De passer du français à l'anglais, Elisabeth, c'est tout un défi. Tu es meilleure que moi, je dois l'admettre. À l'Observatoire sur le Moyen-Orient et l'Afrique du Nord de la chaire Raoul-Dandurand en études stratégiques et diplomatiques. Paul and I met, I think it was in 2006 in Chicago?
2006 or 2007.
2006 or 2007 at the ISA, at the International Studies Association, and that's why I'm wearing a Chicago Landmark t-shirt today for the occasion. Paul, thank you so much for being here. Paul va donner une conférence d'une quarantaine de minutes, 45 minutes environ, sur le thème de sa présentation. So a 45-minute talk, and then we can open up the floor for questions, for a Q&A session. Vous pourrez poser vos questions en anglais ou en français, comme vous le souhaitez. Je pourrai traduire les questions, si vous le souhaitez. Et je salue au passage, je vous parle ici en personne, mais je salue au passage les gens qui nous regardent à la maison. Si vous avez des questions, je crois qu'il est possible de les soumettre à notre attention directement sur la page sur laquelle vous êtes en train de regarder la conférence. Donc, without further ado, Paul, I would welcome to Montreal again, and let's kick things off with the talk. Thank you so much, Paul.
The title of my talk, The Geopolitics of Pipelines in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, is a subject that's become quite important for global politics, as we've seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I apologize that I do not speak French, and my English is only slightly better than my French. But what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about why this topic is so significant. And to kick it off, these were 3 questions that I saw from the related to what I had written in the abstract for Fred. You know, what is the future for oil and gas? How are energy giants trying to shape regional production? And what are the risks to stability? These questions came from the fact that the traditional geostrategic readings of the Syrian and Libyan civil wars have neglected important political economic factors. And so this research seeks to examine a world systems theory approach to examining regional security. Regional bipolarity in the Middle East, along with the Sunni-Shia split, has some explanatory significance. But the absence of a political economic perspective is an important contributor to trying to understand why conflict is occurring in the Middle East, but also between Russia and Europe, and what Russia is trying to do to exert its influence with oil and gas. This project has been in the works for a couple of years, about 3 years now, with my colleague Halit Tagma at Northern Arizona University. And we've been working on trying to understand what literally we are force-fed in academia, that mainstream IR theory is one of the main ways that we examine international politics. And so what we argue in our initial paper on this topic, and what we'll argue later in the book that we hope to publish within the next year or so, is that you truly need to look at a political economic perspective to get a broader worldview, if you will, of conflict in the world. And so by examining the natural resource grab, by examining pipeline politics, if you will, through world systems theory, we believe that you can actually get a better understanding of state behavior. And we'll begin to see this by examining the Middle East first, but then also the Eastern Mediterranean. So in world systems theory is opposed to the anarchic view of the international system that is presented by realism. What we see in world systems theory is that the world is hierarchically ordered, that you have a division of labor where capitalist interests in the core countries seek to exploit the peripheral countries, such as those within the Middle East and in Africa, which they did during colonialism. Effectively, what's happening is the core countries are setting the actors within the periphery against each other in order to suit their interests, specifically their economic interests. And the main goal is to acquire national capital. The ruling elite in the periphery are generally known as compradors, according to Immanuel Wallerstein. And the compradors work with the elites in the core countries to ensure that their interests are protected, the core interests are protected. And so with world systems theory, this allows us to critique the status quo, the fact that there is this exploitative relationship between countries in the core, such as the United States or France or Great Britain, and those in the periphery, in this case, the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The world systems theory structures the observation of the world based upon material interests. And what we argue in our paper, and then we'll argue in the book, and continuing the argument that was made by Raymond Hinnenbusch, was that the Sykes-Picot Agreement created a hierarchical relationship within the broader Middle East that sought to protect British and French interests as they created the British and French Mandate, and then arbitrarily created the countries of the Middle East that during the Cold War would later be exploited by the United States and the Soviet Union and later Russia. So here are 6 assumptions of world systems theory. That we live in a world system that is dominated by certain core interests of elites, that there is a division of labor, but often that division of labor is done to benefit the core countries and to ensure that elites' interests are protected. Financial interests are important, and it's one of the things that I will argue today is that these financial interests are behind the role of oil and gas companies in the modern 21st century in influencing states in the core to get involved on certain regions of the world, whether it's in Europe with Ukraine or the Middle East and North Africa. So essentially, world systems theory and dependency theory from political economy are a good theoretical tool, if you will, to help us understand the relationship between the core countries and the periphery. And I will explain these relationships today as we talk about the Syrian civil war, the Libyan civil war, and then what's happened with Ukraine and the extension of pipelines moving forward. So let's apply world systems theory to the Middle East. So as many of you are probably familiar, the origins of the Syrian civil war have been considered to be one of the largest droughts between 2008 and 2011, the lack of agricultural farmland that was affected by the drought, but was also affected by the Assad regime, both the son and the father, giving land to certain ethnic groups over others. Hence, there being economic explanations for the civil war as well as sectarian reasons. According to world systems theory, the Sykes-Picot Agreement sought to bring order through disorder. It wanted to ensure the subordination of regional states into the hierarchical global economic system. It was drafted to instigate both intra-state conflict and interfactional rivalry. The continuation of the Syrian and Libyan civil war post-2011 occurred because of political economic reasons. It can be traced to past and present foreign economic designs. Global capitalist interests were utilizing core countries' governmental apparatuses, and they were utilizing these apparatuses to secure natural resources in the eastern part of Syria, post-Arab Spring, in the early years of the Civil War, and then by 2015, after Russia intervened in the Syrian Civil War, they began to also look to Libya in North Africa and the entanglements that were going on in the Libyan Civil War. You began to see regional and international actors get involved there. So number one is to secure natural resources. Second was to ensure friendly pipelines would be established between the region and Europe, because Europe relies extensively upon natural resources from Russia, but also from the Middle East. And then third, to curtail the efforts of semi-peripheral countries, Russia and Iran, whose desire was to build pipelines that would increase their influence on the market. They also wanted to prevent the introduction of energy supplies into world markets to ensure that they would only benefit certain core countries' interests as well as their corporations. And then fifth, to bolster and utilize Syrian and Libyan minorities in local conflicts. This way, the core countries can appear to legitimize any intervention into a Syria, a Libya, or now most recently a Ukraine as humanitarian intervention. In world systems theory, we look at the relationship that the British government has with British Petroleum, the Dutch government has with Shell, the French has with Total, and the US with Chevron and ExxonMobil. These are some of the major oil and gas companies in the world. So these interests are being resisted by Russia and Iran and their governmental apparatuses. For Russia and Iran, they are interested in building and maintaining a supplier relationship with European markets. They are also in favor of an Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline instead of the US and Western-backed Qatar-Saudi Arabia-Lebanon pipeline. Now, it must be said that these actual pipelines were never built, but this was discussion that was going on in the lead-up to the Syrian civil war. Russia and Iran are also wanting to inhibit the development of a core country protected Kurdistan region within Syria. They did not want core countries to establish military bases in Kurdish territory in northeastern Syria. And number 4, they wanted to ensure that their client, Assad, would not fall. And Russia, one of Russia's interests for wanting to intervene in the Syrian civil war, aside from Assad being a major ally of Russia, was Putin saw what the West had done to Gaddafi in overthrowing him in Libya, and they wanted to ensure that their other major client would not fall. But given the Russian, Iran, and Assad successes after 2015, and the additional discovery of gas reserves in the Eastern Mediterranean off of Cyprus and off of Egypt and off of the coast of Israel, the issue of the Syrian civil war itself and involvement in the Syrian civil war by the West began to diminish. And that's what I want to talk about for the remainder of this afternoon. That there are factions within these countries that are supported by each of these major actors. Iran is a party to the Syrian civil war on the same side as Russia. And since 2015, their main effort was to ensure that the United States could not establish a foothold within Syria, as I mentioned. And world systems theory suggests that materialism, these historical and social forces, help us to understand the economic motivations that are happening, that are influencing international intervention in places like Syria and like Libya, and even now Ukraine. Just to show you, here's a map of all of these various pipelines. The red are the gas pipelines from Qatar and Iran. So the Pars natural gas field here in the Persian Gulf is shared by both Qatar and Iran. And so Qatar has been hugely influential most recently since the development of their gas resources in the last 15 years in selling natural gas throughout the Middle East, but also trying to get that gas into Europe, and then also over to China. So if we examine Syria, and you look at where the oil fields are, you have oil fields in the northeast, you have oil fields here in the east. Now, in the period of 2014, 2015, 2016, effectively, yes, things would go blank for many people. These maps are meant to show where the oil and gas pipelines are. And as I was, okay, I guess I can't hit that button. Apologies, everyone. All right. So I'm going to talk really loud, but these pipelines they've basically been eliminated. Well, not eliminated, but they've been under constant threat throughout the major years of the Civil War. And in the East, this is where ISIS was occupying this land and occupying this territory. And this is when the United States and the Wagner Group came in to eastern Syria to fight over this land. And the American Special Forces were there to protect the Conoco oil fields that are on the eastern side, in that blue part of the map, on the central map here. That slide was going to say the first cut at looking at this issue was the fact that the United States was in Syria. It had sent special forces in there, because if you'll remember, the Obama administration did not want to fully intervene in the Syrian civil war, did not want to be like the Bush administration and drag the United States into a long, drawn-out conflict. So instead, we used special forces to protect these oil fields, because Conoco is an American oil company, and the Russian and the Wagner Group came in because they wanted to have access to this oil and ensure that they could hopefully take that territory and hook it up to the existing pipelines that the Assad regime could use. So that's the first cut or explanation of why the Syrian civil war was continuing between 2015 and 2020, was the idea that there was Western interest in having access to the oil that was underneath the ground in Syria. Now, Syria was not a huge supplier, but in the subject of oil, it's about, and gas, it's about diversification. Major suppliers want to be able to have different avenues of collecting oil and gas that they could potentially use for domestic consumption and internationally. Now, these animations are showing that President Trump in 2018 said, well, no, we are going to withdraw from Syria after a phone call with Turkish President Erdogan. Because Erdogan, unhappy that the Kurds were being supported by the Americans, Erdogan had a phone call asking Trump to remove American forces, and Trump agreed. Because he already knew that we had special forces in the east that were controlling this territory, and that we can withdraw larger military units that were there and protecting the Kurds. And what ended up happening is the Turkish military went in and created a buffer zone within northern Syria, and also actually committed some ethnic cleansing against the Kurds in that area. You know, and these are from tweets that Trump posted in October of 2019 after a number of Republican colleagues were saying that, what are you doing? Why are you withdrawing American forces from Syria when we need to protect these interests? And what we're arguing, according to world systems theory, is that elites within the American government, you know, many who work for Republican and Democratic administrations, they have that similar interest. They all have similar interests in wanting to protect corporate interests. You know, it's this corporate interest that helps to fuel, pardon the pun, helps to fuel the desire and interest of states to get involved within the region. So that's why post-2015, we've seen more of an effort focusing on pipelines and focusing on oil and gas being transmitted to Europe from Russia, but also the diversification of resources. And that's why we begin to see Russia take a bigger interest in trying to diversify access to resources in the Middle East because of its dispute with Ukraine, because of the Orange Revolution and the Americans, the French, the British, in supporting the Orange Revolution. This upset Putin, basically arguing that this is a continuation of NATO expanding to the east, trying to incorporate Ukraine as part of the West, when Ukraine is one of the countries where a major pipeline transits from Russia to Europe. And Russia did not want to see the West have more control over this oil. This is why you have the European Union attempt to diversify its supply portfolio by working with oil and gas companies to go into Libya, you know, to secure supplies within Syria, so that way they could diversify access to resources. And then in 2014, Putin and the Russian military annex Crimea, because this would be an opportunity to have a port on the Eastern Mediterranean that would help to not only protect ethnic Russians, according to Putin, but it was also a way to control shipping, to be able to try and influence the development of future pipelines that we will see come 2019. Now, of course, the 2022 Russo-Ukrainian War, you know, famously, John Mearsheimer argued that it was the expansion of NATO and the European Union, a very realpolitik, realist perspective, that influenced Russia coming back and wanting to continue to try and influence Ukrainian politics. You know, that's one view, but another view is that it's more about the economics. It's about having the ability to diversify your access to oil and gas, because Europe is the #1 importer of natural gas, and Russia is the #1 exporter of natural gas. So Russia needed to diversify and did not want Ukraine to continue to harm its ability to receive profits from oil and gas, because that was the beginnings of the conflict in 2006 and 2009, when the Ukrainian government was stealing money because it is a transit country. It was taking money that the Russians believed that was theirs and instead was holding on to it. And Russia did not like this. And this was one of the reasons that Putin decided to use the Wagner Group, for plausible deniability's sake, to intervene in eastern Ukraine, with the excuse being that it was to protect ethnic Russians in places like Donbass. So the South Pars North Dome field is in Qatar, in the Persian Gulf, one of the largest, or the largest, largest natural gas source, shared by both Iran and Qatar. So this is why you have the conflict shifting to the Eastern Mediterranean, because you had gas found off the shores of Israel and off of Cyprus. And this began discussions in 2019 of building what was known as the Eastern Mediterranean Pipeline, and then also Total receiving contracts from the Government of National Accord in western Libya, and Turkey was supporting this Government of National Accord. It extended its economic zone, exclusive economic zone. Generally, an exclusive economic zone only extends 20 miles off the coast, according to the UN law of the sea. Now what was happening is that Turkey, because of its desire to expand its influence and support the Government of National Accord to potentially get access to any new natural gas that was going to be shipped to Europe, and the fact that the US, Greece, Israel, Lebanon, they did not want Turkey to get involved in the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline, that you began to see shifting influence in who was supporting whom in both Libya, but also within the Eastern Mediterranean. And so what we see today is on the left here, these are natural gas sites that I've been referring to, that both Egypt uses, and it has refining capabilities for liquefied natural gas, that it is said that it would be happy to help ship that out so it could make even more money than it already has been making. But then you've also had conflict over Cyprus and the Aphrodite gas field, because the Turkish Cypriot government and the Republic of Cyprus are in conflict over who actually controls these gas fields off of the coast of Cyprus. And as I mentioned, the US, Israel, and Lebanon have been trying to prevent the creation of this East Med pipeline, because it would prevent Turkey from getting access to this natural gas and the profits from it. So what's ended up happening is Russia has re-engaged with Turkey and is working on establishing establishing a Turk Stream pipeline. But also you have the situation with Nord Stream 2, where the United States has been, they've claimed that it was sabotage, but Seymour Hersh, the investigative journalist, has reported that it was actually the United States who destroyed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline back in September to prevent the Russians from acquiring more profits from the sale of natural gas to Europe. And so that's what we're going to see in the years ahead, is the continued conflict. So here, this chart right here is an example of where the Russian Navy and the American Navy and the French Navy and British Navy have been stationed since 2019 to protect these natural gas fields and the exploration of these fields by Western oil companies. All right, well, I'll finish talking without using the PowerPoint. So the reason this matters is that the invasion of Ukraine and the instability in Libya and Syria, but the fact that they are sources of natural gas and of oil, and the pipelines are there, and there is a history of these countries like Libya selling oil and gas to Europe, the fact that even Algeria sells natural gas to Europe, that these Western oil and gas companies are seeking to profit off of these conflicts. And the Libyan and Syrian civil wars can be seen clearly through a political economic perspective like world systems theory. Because you are seeing the nature of this hierarchical system with core economic interests driving where these countries are choosing to intervene and who they seek to support. You see this with Israel and Turkey, with Greece, with France, and the United States, all concerned with shelf delimitation, where the continental shelf, where their exclusive economic zone ends, and who has control. There's been instances of freighters from Turkey colliding with ships off of Cyprus, leading to international incidences. And you have Egypt in this last year has been discussing sending gas, more gas to Israel, but also working with major oil companies to establish pipelines up to Syria for the eventuality of the end of the war. And you're seeing Europe, especially after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, seeking to diversify where it gets its oil and gas. Russia is working much more closely with Turkey. And since Israel, Greece, the Republic of Cyprus, Egypt, and the United States did not include Turkey in Eastern Mediterranean discussions, you're going to see Turkey now working more in supporting the government of national accord in Libya to ensure that it could potentially profit from oil and gas sales from Libya. Russia has also been working closely with the Erdogan government to build the Turk Stream pipeline. And Egypt has actually become a major player now in the Eastern Mediterranean because of the Zohr natural gas field that was found in 2015. Now, the important thing to remember here is that the search for gas in the Eastern Mediterranean or even on land is very, very expensive. The only ones who can finance these type of projects are major oil and gas companies and states. And many of the states in the core countries, like the US, like France, like Great Britain, have supported Total and British Petroleum and ExxonMobil to reach, and Shell, to go out and assist the countries of Libya, to assist Egypt and Cyprus in the creation of pipelines potentially, but also in search of these fields. So in sum, an understanding of geopolitics and political economy is better articulated when we account for the actual costs of international conflict on citizens of the planet: blood, sweat, tears, taxes, and environmental catastrophes for our planet. And what we're seeing in the Middle East and in the Eastern Mediterranean is a regional security complex that is going to be driven a lot by these economic interests because of how colonialism established this region in the first place and has driven its politics for over 100 years. So thank you all very much. Sorry for the animations. That's what I get for trying to be fancy. I should be a Luddite more. It might be actually helpful. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Alors, comme je le disais au début de la présentation, nous avons du temps pour des questions et réponses. Let's kick things off with a Q&A session, if you will, Paul. Okay. And je commencerai peut-être par vous demander ici, dans la salle, si vous avez des questions, ou sinon, ben, je peux prendre des questions des gens qui regardent la conférence à la maison. Donc, commencez à réfléchir à vos questions. Moi, je vais en poser une pour commencer. I'm going to start with a question, Paul, if you will. Thank you so much for the presentation. I want to ask you a question about Western energy transition. As we know, the U.S. and major Western powers want to accelerate the energy transition and further reduce their dependence on fossil fuels, especially from so-called less secure regions of the world. And I think the Middle East is one of the regions where, you know, the U.S. Wants to do maybe a little less in the future. We have all these talks about energy independence. It's been around for several presidencies. I would like to know what you think is the future of the countries you're interested in today in that context, what this region will look like after 10, 20, 30 years of Western energy transition.
Thank you, Fred. That's a tall order with a lot of different moving parts. But I think what we're going to see is Russia continuing to try and diversify and building relationships in the Middle East to counter the United States' influence in the region. Now, granted, the United States' influence in the region has declined precipitously in the last 3-4 years, but I think you're seeing, because of America's military presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, because now the European countries and America have agreed that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was an existential threat to the existence of the liberal international order, I think you're going to see a lot more countries align with the United States in North Africa and in the Eastern Mediterranean because of the issue of oil and natural gas. Because many of these oil companies and gas companies are from the West, these American companies are getting precedent in establishing and assisting the building of these resources and being able to ship them. Now, back in 2001, just prior to Putin's ordering the invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration said that it would no longer support the East Med pipeline to try and dissuade Putin from wanting to invade Ukraine. But he did so anyway. What I think will happen in the next 5 to 10 years is that you'll begin to see, you know, Israel, Cyprus, Greece, they'll begin to have further discussions, and even Egypt and Israel, further discussions about building this East Med pipeline. Because there's further opportunity for not just their state-owned oil companies to profit, but also our Western oil and gas companies to profit. And this would allow for the diversification to limit the amount of gas that Russia can sell, especially with Putin as president.
Thank you. If you have questions, feel free to ask your questions. I have another one. Next week marks the 20th anniversary of the intervention in Iraq. I would like to know, what do you think have been the main consequences of the intervention on the geopolitics of fossil fuels in the region? And could you say a few words about how this anniversary will be experienced in the U.S., knowing, as you said, that this has affected how presidencies have viewed the region since what Obama said about Syria, you know, we're going to lead from behind, we're going to turn to other regions. And could you say a few words about the consequences of the intervention on the region, and how will this be remembered in the States next week? And I know there's a debate about that, but
I'll just give you my perspective as opposed to talking about the full debate. Well, I think the major consequence of the war in Iraq was the instability that we saw and kind of the exacerbation of what we ended up seeing in the Syrian civil war. But I think what it ultimately, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of oil and gas, we have effectively hurt the Kurds, and they will almost never be able to have a state of their own. And so what we're going to end up seeing is the Kurds working a lot potentially with the sale of gas and oil to Russia, because Iraq is still receiving funds from the sale of Kurdish gas and oil as part of the agreements that the Kurdish regional government and the government in Baghdad came up with about 3-4 years ago. That you're going to see, internal domestic politics between the Kurdish government and the Iraqi government that'll be exploited by Qatar. It'll be exploited by Russia, I believe. And ultimately, it's the intervention there and the subsequent consequences with ISIS and the prolonging of the Syrian civil war and the Libyan civil war, that a lot of these governments don't necessarily trust American interests in the region. And so I think that it's going to continue to allow for sectarian conflict, even though Iran and Saudi Arabia have, kind of made up, if you will, yesterday, that was announced by the Chinese government. We're going to continue to see, I think, battles over economics and who is going to influence the development of these pipelines and who's going to be able to sell oil and gas and profit. And it's going to be certain authoritarian governments and not necessarily Western governments. Now, to the second question about how is it going to be viewed in the United States, I think you'll see many folks are unhappy, with the fact that so many lives were lost, in benefiting the interests of a few wealthy elites, and that a lot of what we saw in the years after the invasion, that we saw that a lot of this was done for purely economic motivation and power purposes to benefit a wealthy few in the core countries, these elites, as opposed to actually helping, spread democracy once they couldn't find nuclear weapons. The notion of trying to spread democracy was a farce. It was, go ahead.
When it comes to explaining that decision, I was listening to you during the conference, and I was looking at this article that was published by Daniel Lieberfeld in 2005, titled Theories of Conflict and the Iraq War. And he was comparing various theories to explain why the U.S. decided to intervene in Iraq. So realism, liberalism, ideological influences, the influence of the neocons, we all remember that, personality and social psychology, and things like that. But what I'm hearing from your answer is that you think the world systems theory is also interesting to explain why the U.S. decided to intervene in Iraq. So people were saying at the time, this is all because of oil. That was a simplistic explanation, but what I'm hearing is that there were very powerful economic interests at the time also, and that maybe the theory you're using to think about the region today is also useful to explain why the U.S. decided to intervene in Iraq.
Yes, Fred, that's exactly what I'm doing, because it's, my colleague Hal and I are doing in our work, is because national interests are social constructs. That if you believe world systems theory and the view that it has of the world, all you have to do is look at the development of economics in our world, and the role of labor and the role of capitalism and how it influences the development of systems that impact the behavior that the elites have over labor. It's world systems theory, as many of you are probably familiar, is derived from Marxism. And so I think, think of this as one explanation among all those others that you mentioned from that article. But all you have to do is look at and see what's happening right now in these last couple years, is that you're seeing these companies profiting immensely off of the backs of of the ethnic conflict, of battles against terrorist groups, when in reality it's just about lining the pockets of a wealthy few elite at the expense of the groups within a particular region.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. I just want to make sure I have the... Yeah, we have a few questions from the audience. Great. The first one is about China. So you talked about Russia, the U.S., a little bit about China, but could you say a few more words about China's role in the region, interests, and what's the policy in the region?
Well, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has sought to develop economic relationships, trade relationships to ensure a supply of oil and gas reaches the People's Republic of China because of the growing demand for oil and gas within China. And so China has established a military and economic trade deal with Iran, helping it to bypass the sanctions during negotiations around the Iranian nuclear deal. China has also sought to assist Syria and has mentioned to Syria that they will assist in rebuilding Syria when the war is quote-unquote over. And just recently, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the new foreign minister has said that, not foreign minister, prime minister has said that the Saudis and the Iranians have agreed to kind of a de-escalation of tensions to begin to work together on the future. So China's foreign policy generally in the region and more broadly as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative is to establish these economic and military trade deals, not just in the Middle East or in Africa, but even within Eastern Europe, to ensure a supply of oil and gas will continue, but also to be seen as a counter to the United States.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. It goes like this. What are the implications for the region with the newly created East Mediterranean Gas Forum? And what will be the response from Turkey as it has been excluded from the organization?
That's a good question. The Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, right now, they are continuing to work with Western oil companies to extract the natural gas and to look for other sites around the Aphrodite and others that were already found. The Mediterranean Forum is going to be a mechanism for negotiations, but in the natural gas market, as in the oil market, a lot of the discussions are still bilateral. Although these forums exist, they are effectively, I believe, for show, to show that these countries are interested in working together on an issue of mutual concern, but any deals are actually done bilaterally. So Israel and Cyprus, or Cyprus and Turkey. So I think the response for Turkey is going to be an interesting one. It's going to have to balance its relationship with Russia with economic trade deals and the building of an expansion of the Turk Stream pipeline and getting gas from Central Asia, while at the same time it is a NATO member, and so it has to walk that line of ensuring that it's not going to completely side with Russia on a number of issues. And so that's why I think you'll see Turkey be very influential in what happens with Libya, in the sale of natural gas and oil coming from Libya.
Thank you, Paul. So Paul is a teaching professor and coordinator of MPA special programs in the Department of Politics and International Affairs at Northern Arizona University. A great friend of la chaire Raoul-Dandurand en études stratégiques et diplomatiques également, parce qu'il est membre chercheur associé à l'Observatoire sur le Moyen-Orient et l'Afrique du Nord. Je vous remercie d'avoir assisté à cette conférence. On a beaucoup d'événements qui s'en viennent. Je ne dresserai pas la liste de toutes ces conférences qu'on vous propose dans les prochaines semaines, mais je vous invite à consulter notre site Internet au dandurand.uqam.ca. Continuez à nous suivre sur les médias sociaux et tout ça. Et je vous remercie d'avoir été là. Merci aux gens à la maison aussi pour les questions. Et thank you so much, Paul. You're going to be here in Montreal for the week. So we'll have the opportunity to discuss these issues with you all week. We're very fortunate. Thank you so much for being in Montreal, and I hope you enjoy your week with us. Thank you. Yep. Merci.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all for attending.